All right, hello everyone. My name is Terri Taylor. I'm an Education Programs Manager at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, and I want to thank you for coming out this afternoon to visit the museum and to come to this program called Reading Douglas Author Talk with Treopia Green Washington with her book In Spite Of. This book talk, Reading Douglas, is in connection with our current exhibition, Reading Douglas, which explores reading as both an act of resistance and restoration that can profoundly impact our lives. We are so excited today to have Mrs. Treopia Green Washington, who authored her memoir, In Spite Of, in this book conversation with our executive director, Terri Freeman. In her memoir, Treopia Green Washington shares her experiences of life during the Jim Crow era. She grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, in a community determined to protect its children as much as possible from the cruelty of segregation laws designed to make people feel less than. You may have heard of her brother, Ernest Green, who was one of the Little Rock 9 high school students who integrated Central High School in the face of shocking violence. In her memoir, we learn about Treopia's journey as a child growing up in Little Rock to her migration to Maryland, becoming an educator. She began her career in public education as a kindergarten and first grade teacher, later serving as an early childhood administrator, Title I parent coordinator, and resource teacher for educational television. In 1988, Mrs. Washington was appointed by President William J. Clinton to the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities, HBCUs, where she served as special assistant to the executive director until 2001. Following the conclusion of the Clinton administration, she served as vice president of partnerships and minority affairs at the National Board for Professional Teacher Standards, where she focused on efforts to increase the presence of teachers in underrepresented communities. Treopia currently serves as director of special initiatives for the College of Education at Bowie State University in Maryland. She is also a workshop facilitator, panelist, and keynote speaker for universities, school systems, and national organizations, along with being a board member for organizations and institutions. I'm sure you will enjoy this conversation with Treopia and our executive director, Terri Freeman. A Q&A will follow with a book signing when we conclude. At this time, I will turn it over to our director, Terri Freeman.
Thank you, Terri. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. And I know this is going to be an enjoyable conversation because I've had the opportunity not to read the book, but to actually see Ms. Treopia in action talking on several YouTubes about her book. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity. And you don't mind me calling you Treopia, do you? Okay. Okay. Well, let's just jump right in. What inspired you to write your own memoir?
Well, when I began working at Bowie, the dean who hired me shortly after she hired me said, "Treopia, you should write a book." I said, "A book? A book about what?" And she said, "You need to share your experiences." That was in 2011. I finally began writing the book in 2021. And I guess one of the reasons I finally decided to begin recording some of my experiences was that I realized that many young people have no idea of the kinds of things, experiences that we had growing up, and no idea of what led to the opportunities that they have now.
And how'd you come up with the title, In Spite Of?
Well, I immediately thought about, or came up with that title because in spite of everything, my family, as well as other families, did the things that made it possible for us to be successful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, as I was watching your, the YouTubes, the series of YouTubes, and it's 15 YouTubes that are like 3.5 minutes long each, and it goes over a lot of the content that you have in your book.
And I had no idea that existed.
Well, it's out there. And as I was listening to it, I kept thinking, you know, each of us have a story, but we don't think of it in terms of putting it together as a story that would be of interest to other people. And your journey is just beautiful. So let's talk about your childhood a little bit. You grew up in the Jim Crow South in Little Rock, Arkansas. Having spent some time, even though it was recent, in Memphis, Tennessee, I did travel back and forth to Mississippi and a couple times to Little Rock, in fact, and you can still feel some of what was heavy in the South. So tell us a little bit about your life growing up as a child in Little Rock.
Well, when I was growing up in Little Rock, Jim Crow and segregation laws were very much in place. We knew that we couldn't go to restaurants. We knew that we couldn't stay in hotels. That was the law. And in fact, one of the instances that I have cited in my book, and my brother and I still talk about it, was the Sunday that my mother and father after church decided to take us to MacArthur Park to listen to a concert. I think I was about 10, my brother was younger, and my younger brother was much younger. And as we stepped on the curb, the policeman met us and said, "We don't allow color to listen to this music." And my mother and father both just, my mother said quietly, "We will do something else nice this afternoon." We turned around and walked away. But again, that was the one thing that I remember. But growing up, our family, our neighborhood, our church family, I guess really protected us from being hurt. And they expected all the children, all the young people to be successful. I cite, again in the book, one of our neighbors who used to take me to nursery school, and I still smell Ivory Smoke's soap from nursery school. But she and her husband had 3 sons, and one became the first judge in Gary, Indiana, first Black judge. The other became vice president of Miller Brewing Company, and the other became a dentist in Atlanta. And across the street from them, the first Black millionaire salesman for Allstate Insurance grew up. So the neighborhood was full of people who became successful, who grew up in Jim Crow, but because our parents, our family, our neighborhood pushed us, in fact, I tell people, mediocrity was not accepted, only excellence. And that was, I found a book that I had, all that stuff is part of my archives, but one of the former students at Dunbar High School, which was my alma mater, became dean at Howard University, and she did a study of Dunbar students and the successes that they have achieved. And it's simply because, in spite of the Jim Crow laws and segregation, our people our families expected us to excel, not just achieve, but excel.
Yes, so you mentioned that there really was no need to have the talk because that just kind of wasn't an issue.
No, you are absolutely right. The talk is, and I'll tell a little bit about what the talk that I had with my son who's sitting over there. But the talk wasn't necessary because we knew what the rules were.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules were that there were certain barriers that that existed, and we recognized those barriers,
Mm-hmm.
and we adhered to those barriers. But now, I talk about the talk that I had with my son. When I had the privilege of serving as a national judge for the Disney Teacher Awards, Disney would always send for my son and me to come out to Disneyland for 4 years to do what I had to do. And the day that we would arrive at the hotel, I would always make it a point to take him around the entire hotel,
Mm-hmm.
the restaurants, the swimming pool, because I wanted them to know that he was not an interloper, that he was a guest. But again, that wasn't necessary when I was growing up because we couldn't go to those places anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew what existed for us.
It's very interesting because although, well, I can say that I actually grew up in a very segregated community because I grew up in Chicago, which was known to be the most segregated city in the country. But because of that, my parents didn't have to talk with me either. There was no need to have that because you knew where you were, what you were going to be doing, and those sorts of things. But I am curious, you mentioned that you knew what the law was. Did your parents tell you about the laws around Jim Crow or just?
No, we did discuss that as a family, but it was known.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who lived, plus I was thinking of something else as you were asking the question. I can remember reading as a little girl in the Arkansas State Press, which was the black paper, newspaper, about lynchings. And it was enough to understand that people could be hung from a tree if it was perceived that they did something that they should not have done. So I think that kind of atmosphere reinforced the fact that there were laws and things that we couldn't do and things that we could do.
Okay. Talk a little bit about high school because this is very interesting. Where did you go to high school?
Our high school was Dunbar High School, and there's a quote, and I'm not quoting it correctly, but it says it was the finest school for colored youth in the country. And I have on this table a study that was done by one of the former students who ultimately became Dean of Education at Howard University. And she did a study on, I think she interviewed over 200 former Dunbar students. It opened as a school in 1930 and stayed a high school until 1955. But again, excellence was the only thing that was accepted. I don't remember people who failed. And all my classes at Dunbar, I just don't remember people who did not excel.
And so you went to high school in Washington?
No,
No.
Little Rock.
Little Rock, okay. at Little Rock Dunbar. But your brother was actually a part of the Little Rock Nine.
Yes, and you know, when you say Little Rock Nine and Little Rock, people sometimes have a quizzical look. But the important thing to remember is that after the Supreme Court decision of 1954, in which school systems throughout the South were admonished to begin integration or desegregation, because there's a big difference.
Right.
And it was mostly desegregation. But Little Rock was the only situation in which President Eisenhower had to deploy 1,000 troops to escort 9 students into school.
Wow.
Which, the more you think about it, the more ridiculous it is. But because there was such a confrontation when they began to enter, they were immediately, that first day, withdrawn. And I remember my mother and I talked every day, and it was on my brother's birthday, September 22nd, that she received a telegram from President Eisenhower. He sent a telegram to all 9 families, and he said that the next day there would be 1,000 troops in Little Rock because those students were going to get into school. And what prompted that, the governor, in his infinite wisdom, as quotation marks, instead of using the Arkansas National Guard to help the students get into school, he instructed the National Guard to keep them out of school. So after the first day, when they tried to go to school, the huge mob outside, in fact, they were told to go home because it was too dangerous. And that's when President Eisenhower sent 1,000 troops. And I laugh because the night they flew in that very next day. They set up tents on Central High's grounds. And that morning, these 9 students trying to integrate Central High went to Daisy Bates' house as they usually did. And there were 2 cars for them. And in front of the first car was a Jeep with soldiers with machine guns at the ready. At the back, behind the second car, there was a Jeep, same thing with soldiers. And my brother's comment that day was, I think we'll get in school today. But that actually happened, and the soldiers stayed in Little Rock until I think it was about December.
So did your brother talk about what it felt like in the school when he was inside the building?
Well, as I said, my mother, I would call home every evening. And I remember one incident when I called and my brother had prepared a physics project. And he had mentioned before that the physics teacher was the only one who had shown outward animosity toward him being there. And of course, physics is not the easiest subject in the world. But he had prepared this project, put it in his locker, and when he came back from lunch to take it to class, his locker had been broken into and the project destroyed. And of course, that gave the physics teacher an excuse to give him a failing grade. But fortunately, for that particular class, he became friends with a doctor who taught at the University of Arkansas Medical School. And the doctor tutored him every Saturday, and he passed physics. But after the soldiers left especially, there were situations that were tough. He talked about the day that they went to shower after gym, the 3 boys, and there was broken glass placed at the entrance to the shower. So they stepped on broken glass. But that was, and he didn't talk much. In fact, I guess our family was such that my mother always looked on the positive side of things, and talking about negative was not something that we did a lot. But I know at one point she asked if he wanted to come to Baltimore to live with me, to finish school, and his response was, no, I have assumed this responsibility and I intend to see it through.
That's pretty incredible for a high school student. I mean, just what they were having to put up with. I can't imagine, I mean, high school is tough enough, right? But I cannot imagine, you know, you're going to high school and there's a Jeep full of armed military and an environment of incredibly angry white people all around, just a mob.
And the soldiers, while the soldiers were there, each of the 9 had a private guard. And the guard would stand outside the classroom door while they were in class. And this went on every day for a while.
Wow.
But one of the interesting things, and that's why I'm a firm believer that if you really do the right thing, good things happen. One of the Arkansas National Guard, who was admonished to keep the students out, remembered my brother. I met his wife, I guess about 15 years ago, and she told me her husband had been one of the National Guard, and that he admired my brother. He remembered him and just admired the way that he carried himself. And the 2 of them met eventually, and their picture was in the newspaper.
Wonderful. Well, there was another special guest that your brother had the opportunity to meet at his graduation, whose name was Martin Luther King Jr. How did that happen, and how did that go for your brother?
Well, Dr. King was the commencement speaker at Arkansas A&M, which is the Black HBCU in Arkansas. And he heard about my brother's graduation. And he called Daisy Bates, who was the NAACP head, who actually led the students through that year, and asked if he could attend the graduation. And I guess she said, sure, come on. So he came to Little Rock and went with my family, my mother, my aunt, my grandfather, to Ernest's graduation. And people have asked Ernest what he and Dr. King talked about. He said nothing, because at the end of graduation, he was so happy to have graduated, and his friends at the other high school were having a party, and he was rushing, trying to get out of there and get away from Dr. King and Daisy Bates. But he really, that was very important to him. And when Dr. King passed, he came to Memphis to his service. To Atlanta.
Well, you have a chapter in your book titled The Lost Years. And this is when the governor closed all the high schools in Little Rock, which I have to tell you, I didn't know anything about, but it had an impact on your family. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, after my brother Ernest graduated from Dunbar, I guess Governor Faubus, again in his infinite wisdom, decided that no other Black person would graduate from high school in Little Rock.
Oh.
So he closed all the high schools.
To
And
all the students, they were just closed.
everybody who was a high school student in Little Rock had no place to go. There were several white academies that were open, but for the Black community, that was not a possibility. And something I found out, the person helping me write the book, that over 50% of the students just lost a year.
Mm.
And with my younger brother, Scott, my mother, and I didn't know this until about 7 or 8 years ago, that my mother tried 8 school districts for him to go to, but because she was teaching, the logistics of getting him to school every day just didn't happen. And so finally in October, she decided the only thing to do would be to send him to Oakland, California, to stay with 2 aunts, my father's sisters, whom Scott had never met. And he went 1,000 miles away for the 10th grade to go to school. But again, many of the other students found no way. And it was just a tragic thing that happened.
Well, how was that for your brother? I mean, that's pretty traumatic, first off, being, removed from one school to another in high school, and then going all the way across the country, different kind of environment, and with aunts that you don't even know.
It was rough. For one thing, and again, we never talked about it specifically. Incidentally, he passed away. He was part of the COVID activity in New York back in 20 rather. But we didn't talk about it, but I think he also had been the person to get all the nasty telephone calls during the year that my brother was at Central. Neither he nor my brother nor my mother talked about any of those kinds of things, but I know that they happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I really think that my brother Scott was the one, because of course my father had passed. And it was just the 3 of them at the home. And I think he
got the brunt of it.
Yes.
Let me ask a question on that. Why do you think it was that they didn't talk about it?
Because in our family, talking about things was not something that we did, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. In fact, when I wrote this book, I could almost see my mother standing there saying, "Treopia, you know you should not have done this." And actually, it was, I think it served us well, that when things happened, you did what was necessary and what was right.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't carry on over. We didn't talk.
It reminds me of what we've learned about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and how for so many years it was not talked about. And some of that was out of fear, but other of that was, I'm sure, a sense of what good will it do if we, if we talk about this. And I wonder if it's a generational kind of thing, where people just, they did it, they took it, they swallowed it, and they just didn't.
I think you're absolutely right. I mentioned in the book, Tulsa, when I was in high school, the black high school in Tulsa, the football team from that high school was always our biggest game. And I remember we would always get beat because they were bigger than our football players were. But that was a few years after the Tulsa massacre, and nobody said anything about it. And yet, our teachers at Dunbar, during, especially during Black History Week at that time, tried to make sure that we knew our history and knew the people that we should know something about.
Mm-hmm.
But Tulsa, the massacre, was never, ever mentioned. And that brings to mind too, when you mentioned that, one of the thoughts I've always wondered about was whether or not my great-grandparents were slaves. Nobody talked about that kind of thing. And I think it was because they wanted us as young people to have a positive outlook. And some of the horrid things that happened were just not mentioned.
Yeah. Your mom, you come from a family of educators, and you yourself are an educator. And your mother was an educator. What challenges with Jim Crow did she face as a teacher? And I'm certain that there were some, but there may have been some, I don't want to call it benefits, but there were some things around segregation that were very supportive. The Black community was very supportive to each other.
And to answer that question, I would have to say, none that I knew of. My mother was a very unique person, not just because she was my mother, but she not only did not focus on negative things, she didn't talk about negative things.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, she somehow managed to let us know what the real story was, but without being negative. And during the time that my brother was desegregating Central High School, my mother's job was never threatened. Yet some of the parents lost their jobs.
Interesting.
But and I think it was because she had, through the years, instilled the kind of respect that people had for her, both Black and white. I mentioned in the book that she was a member of a group called Church Women United. And it was a group of Black and white women. And she would go to meetings, but she didn't talk a lot about it. But I think she really developed the kind of respect that nobody would think about doing anything personal to her.
So tell the audience the story you told me about when you went into the store and how the woman at the counter addressed you and your mom's response?
I was about 4, and as usual, I was shopping with my mother, and the sales lady, young white sales lady, said, "What do you girls want?" My mother turned and looked at me, I was 4, said, "Treopia, she must be talking to you because you are the only girl here." But she had a way of doing that, and I mentioned the other situation that I remember vividly. My brother was a toddler, Ernest was a toddler. We were in Safeway grocery store, and a little white boy called him the N-word, which I refuse to pronounce. But I think you know what the N-word is. And my mother simply said, just loud enough for his mother to hear, "It is unfortunate that his vocabulary is so limited that he has to use language like that."
That's the way you put somebody in their place, okay? And I'm sure she didn't even have a rebuttal to that. I mean, it's hard to have a rebuttal to that. And it just is so interesting because as I was listening to you tell that story, as I was watching your YouTube videos, I kept thinking to myself, oh my goodness, I think Treopia's mom and my grandmother were the same woman. I honestly do, because that's the sort of thing she would do. She was always about use your words and be, know how to cut, if you will, with your words and not have to get into a whole lot of screaming and shouting and all the rest of that sort of thing.
Well, that was what my family practiced. And that's one of the important things I learned from my mother. Number one, you respect all people. And if there are situations in which there could be confrontations, you handle it in a way that you get your point across.
Mm-hmm.
But you do it in a way that does not incite negative activity.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want you all to know that Treopia is kind of like Forrest Gump in a way, because she met all these incredible people, right? So we've already learned about her meeting Dr. King and her brothers meeting Dr. King, but you also met Thurgood Marshall and President Truman, correct? Talk to us about those two experiences.
Well, the Thurgood Marshall situation is one which I remember well. At that time, my mother and aunt, who were teachers, were part of a group of teachers that sued the Little Rock School Board for equal pay for Black teachers, because Black teachers, I was reading something last night, white teachers at that time were being paid $1,000 some a year. That was a lot of money then. Black teachers were paid like $500 some a year. So anyway, this group of teachers sued the Little Rock School Board. The lawyer who represented them was the NAACP lawyer, Thurgood Marshall. On one of his trips to Little Rock, during the run of the case, of course, he couldn't stay in hotels because hotels did not accommodate Black guests. So people were asked to host him. My mother and father were asked to host Thurgood Marshall. Remember, I was about 4 years old because my brother hadn't been born yet. And they said that Thurgood Marshall would fly into Little Rock. Well, people traveled by train and bus at that time. Very few people flew. So I thought the plane was gonna land in my backyard. And I stood by the window, waiting for this plane to land. And the doorbell rang. And Mother announced, Attorney Marshall is here. Well, again, I was 4. I went, how dare he come in the front door when I had been standing all that time waiting for his plane to land. And I met his son when both of us worked in the Clinton administration. And I told him about how his father had really disappointed me. That people have asked, well, what did you say? I don't remember a thing about Attorney Marshall being in my house. All I know was that he didn't
come by plane in your backyard.
That's right.
Okay. And what about the president, Harry Truman?
When Truman was president, the head of the post office where my father worked was wife of the senator, Senator Robinson. And whenever presidents would come to Little Rock, she would always entertain them at dinner at her home. And she would have my father to serve the dinner. So when President Truman was coming to town, my father told my mother where to bring me. Again, I was not 5 years old yet. Where to bring me and where to sit so we could see President Truman. And we sat on the garden bench at the home of Senator Robinson. And President Truman's car pulled up to the walkway. And he passed right by us and he stopped. And he stopped to chat. And I was just saying, I can remember him in his white linen suit and his white Panama hat, because it was summertime. But he stopped and chatted and went in the house. And he's one of the presidents that I've had the privilege of meeting.
You heard that, one of the presidents. So you want to go ahead and just tell us how many others you've met?
Well, I worked with President Clinton, and I knew him as governor of Arkansas, so I had known him for quite some time. And then I met President Bush, President Clinton, and President Bush.
Which Bush?
George Bush.
Okay.
George Bush.
W.
The latter Bush. He and President Clinton had a presidential scholars program in which businessmen went through a number of iterations for about a year. Anyway, the graduation program for the presidential scholars was held in Little Rock several years ago at Central High School. The graduation was at Central High. The other person participating, President Bush, President Clinton, and Tony Blair.
Oh.
From England.
Okay.
And
see, Forrest Gump.
After the presidential scholars were awarded their certificates, there was a dinner at the Clinton Presidential Library, and that's where I met President Bush. In fact, I mentioned that I was sitting near the door, and when he and Laura Bush, his wife, were leaving, I went over to them and I introduced myself. And I told him I was Ernest Green's sister. And he said, oh yes, Ernest is one of my favorite people. He probably said that every time. But he was very pleasant and I was very happy to have met him.
One other person that you met was John Lewis.
Yes.
Talk about that experience.
And there's a picture there. I hope the audience gets a chance to see them. I had, well, the last time I was with John Lewis and the picture was made, a group of students in Hartford, Connecticut decided to create a play about Little Rock, the Little Rock integration crisis. And they called it Paying for Education, I believe. But anyway, during the course of their developing the play, they won the Hartford Prize for the play. They won second place in the state contest, which enabled them to participate in the national history contest. And somehow, someone contacted John Lewis, and he invited them to give the play in his office.
Oh, wow.
And my son and I were invited as guests. So while there, I had a chance to chat with John Lewis. And that's when he told me that he had been inspired by my brother's activity at Central High School to do what he did.
Wow.
And the other time I saw John Lewis was when the Little Rock Historic Site was dedicated.
Okay.
This is a museum across the street from Little Rock Central High School. And John Lewis was the speaker. But on that occasion, when we were in his office for the play, I was just blown away by the fact that he insisted that all of his staff attend the play. And I can hear them now saying, but Mr. Lewis, we have such and such thing to do. He said, no. This is important. You leave whatever you're doing alone and come to the play. And the play, the students were amazing. They were students at the Montessori School in Hartford, Connecticut. And after the play, the congressman said to me, "How's your brother?" I said, "He's fine. Well, be sure to tell him I asked about it."
That's something.
He was just, and I ended up writing a piece that I called about him, that I called The Gentle Giant. Because he was just so gracious, and knowing all of the things that he had done in his lifetime, he could not have been more hospitable, more gracious as he was that day we were in his office.
And a humble man too.
Very humble.
Very humble man. Yes. Well, let's talk a little bit about how you got from Little Rock to Baltimore.
Well, when I graduated from high school, I was 15. And
Okay, you all heard this. She kind of like went over that real quick. So let's one more time. When you graduated from high school, you were
15.
I think there was somebody else who you met who was 15 when they graduated from high school too, and that was Martin Luther King. So you were in good company.
Well, when I graduated, I knew that I was going away to college. And at that time, it was understood that we were going to an HBCU. For one thing, colleges in the South did not admit Black people to college. So it was a choice of this in Nashville, Spelman in Atlanta, Tuskegee in Alabama, or my mother's alma mater, Wilberforce in Ohio. But I wanted to go to Hampton. Hampton was in Virginia. And Hampton was, my mother had, when she was in college, had spent a summer in Hampton and talked about the water and the seashore and all that just sounded so wonderful, because in Little Rock, none of that existed. But anyway, I went to Hampton. And when I graduated from Hampton, I was offered 3 teaching positions. One in Richmond, Virginia, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Baltimore. And at that time, kindergartens were just being installed as part of the public school system. And since my major was early childhood, I was really excited about an opportunity to be in an up-and-coming kindergarten program. And so I chose Baltimore.
And you were pleased with that
And
choice?
I've been here ever since.
That's wonderful. How did you get to Bowie State?
Well, that was another interesting, all of the things that I have had the privilege of doing have come about as a result of something I was doing previously. On June the 17th, Friday, I will never forget it, 2011, I was at home, I had taken the day off, received a call from the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, where I was working. And the person identified herself as the HR person. And she said, today we've decided to eliminate 10 positions, and yours is one of them. Well, after I picked myself off the floor, I said, so when is my last day? She said, today. So I suddenly remembered that I had scheduled a meeting at Bowie with the Dean of the College of Education that Monday, because she was very interested in incorporating some of the national board standards into the curriculum. So I tried to call her, but because it was summertime and it was late, I didn't reach anybody. So I decided I'd better go to Bowie that Monday to keep our meeting. And as I entered, I told the dean, before we talk about anything, I need to let you know what happened. And I told her about Friday's activity. And as I was telling her, she started smiling. And she said, I'm just waiting for you to finish, because I have lots of things that I want you to help me with. So that was my start at Bowie. And it was, she said, now what would you like to do? I said, well, one thing I don't want to do is teach. I said, I don't want to teach anybody anything. So she said, well, you decide what you want your title to be. And she brought in another staff person who just retired this week. But she and I talked, and we came up with the title of Director of Special Initiatives. And as a result, I have been able to plan programs during American Education Week, Black History Month, the awards ceremony in May, just really do some wonderful things. And it's been a joy to work. Incidentally, that dean who hired me was just named provost at Frostburg. Used to be Frostburg State Teachers College, Frostburg University. So she's there now, but she's the one that, and the other thing, after she hired me, she's the one who said, you should write a book. And she would tell people on the campus, when you see Treopia, ask her, has she started her book? But she was really the person who.
I'm sure you sent her a copy, right?
I have been trying to catch up with her to send her a copy, but she's been kind of busy.
Well, I'm gonna ask one last question, then we're gonna open it up to the audience, because it's clear that your mom had a big influence on you. And your final chapter in your book is almost a tribute to your mom in a way, righting a wrong. And I want you to tell us about that, but also what things in particular you think that were so important that your mom taught you, lessons and things that she instilled in you.
You know, there are many things, but one of the things that I have finally been able to incorporate in my life, and that is her theory that there should be no such thing as worry. If you have an issue, you analyze it, decide what you can do about it, do what you can, and then leave it alone. And that really works. She also, as a part of that, would say, there is no sense to lose a night's sleep over anything, because there's very little that you can do between 11 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock the next morning about anything. So you might as well go to sleep, get up the next morning, and deal with what you have to deal with. And those things have really, in fact, people often ask me, are you stressed? No, you don't get stressed, because you also learn what things over which you have no control. And there are certain things that you can't do anything about, like the weather. If there's something going on and there's a rainstorm, you can't change that. So you just do what you can to work around it. But those things have really, really, really stood in good stead. And I guess one of the other things is doing what you think is right. And if you think it's right and you believe in what you're doing, then go with it.
Tell us about that last chapter.
When my mother, when my mother was teaching and we were growing up, we knew that Black teachers were expected to earn graduate points above and beyond their bachelor's degrees. But there were no Southern colleges that accepted Black teachers. And most other teachers, my mother's friends, earned degrees from University of Minnesota, University of Iowa, University of New York. We were young, the three of us, and my mother couldn't go away and stay that long in the summer for 6 weeks. And even now, I think it was kind of not the wisest thing for school system to spend that amount of money to send people away for 6 weeks because they couldn't attend Southern University. Anyway, long story short, in the late 40s, the University of Arkansas set up trailers on what is now University of Arkansas in Little Rock. And Black teachers were able to take courses. My mother completed her courses in 1951 for her master's degree in education. I was standing at the door with her when the postman delivered this box. And in the box was her diploma, her tassel, and a letter that said, "We congratulate you for completing your work, but this is not the time for you to come to campus to receive your degree." So they mailed her diploma. And ever since that time, and that was before I finished high school, that had been on my mind. I remember she read the letter, handed it to me to read, and when I finished, I gave it back to her, and she crumpled it, threw it in the trash, and walked away. And I knew she was hurt. She didn't say anything, but I never forgot it. And finally, in 2011, January the 4th, first day back after Christmas, and something led me to read the profile of the Chancellor of the University of Arkansas. And when I read it, I felt very comforted in reading his profile. And I decided to write an email. And I sent him an email, and I told him about my mother's situation. I told him that who my brother was, that he had been the first Black graduate from Little Central High School. And I sent it. But the minute I hit send, I remembered the Arkansas Razorbacks from university were playing in the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans that day. And I said to myself, nobody is ever going to read this email. 2 days later, I received an email from the Chancellor in which he apologized. He said he was so sorry that happened, but he wanted to prove that things were different now. And beginning then, we had a series of conversations with him and with the Vice President for Diversity, who incidentally has just been named Chancellor of the University of Arkansas, a Black gentleman. And the Chancellor invited my son and me to graduation in May to receive my mother's diploma in a manner that she had not been granted. And we went to the university, and I remember it's in my book, when we checked into the hotel on the campus, the person said, "Oh, you're here to get your mother's degree." So I guess the word had gotten around. But it was absolutely wonderful. There was a reception the morning of graduation, and we were guests, of course. And while we were in the reception, someone came and said, "I need you to come and look at a picture." And the picture he showed me was a picture of my mom. And what I didn't know was that at the time the Chancellor was awarding me her diploma, that her picture was being shown on the Jumbotron. And I'm glad I didn't see it, because I tell people it was enough to try to maintain my composure as it was. But after the reception, we were escorted into the arena. There were 20,000 people in attendance because there were close to 5,000 graduates. And we were seated. There were 2 seats on the front row that said, "Family of LaVere is Green." And my son and I were seated, and we were told by the marshals, when the Chancellor is ready for you to receive your mother's degree, we will come and get you. So they came. He made a wonderful speech about how wrong this was and that things had changed. And it was his privilege to award my mother's degree to me. And prior to the graduation, we had a meeting in his office. He had 3 copies made of her diploma, one for each of us, my 2 brothers. So So that, and what I brought here, the chancellor has just written his, I guess his 4th or 5th book, sent it to me last week, and in it is a chapter about me. And he talks about how when he awarded me my mother's diploma, that people wept openly, and that they gave a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Of course, I didn't know any of this. I was trying to keep from falling off the stage, but it was a wonderful experience. And we have the thing after that. He found out that my son and I both are football fans, and he invited us to a game to be his guest in his skybox at the university.
To see the Razorback.
And he said, you look at the schedule and you choose the game you want to come to. And I remember growing up in Little Rock that the University of Arkansas and Auburn University game was played in Little Rock, but we couldn't go. So I said, that is the game I want to attend. And we did. And we were guests in this skybox in
Who won?
Arkansas.
Okay.
That made it even better.
Right, I'm sure. What an incredible, though, tribute to your mom. I mean, there's not much better that could have happened. Good. Please thank Treopia for this. Now, she's not going anywhere yet. We're gonna give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Sir.
Yeah, I just want to say it's an honor. My fiance and I, we're here from Rockville, so we came to the museum but didn't know the book talk was going on. But your name, Treopia, is that kind of connected to Ethiopia or?
Well, that's another story. Glad you asked. My grandfather, when my aunt and mother were born, my grandfather's name was Eugene, and he said that was too common a name, and his children would not have common names. So my aunt was born first, and he named her Treopia. He was an avid reader, and we think it had Greek origins. He also named her Treopia Victoria after Queen Victoria in England. And then when my mother was born, she was named Lothair. Neither of the names have I ever run into in all of my life. In fact, I tell people I was in Times Square once, and somebody said, Treopia. Well, I knew they were talking to me. And it happened to be somebody I was in college with. But when I was little, I used to detest the name because I couldn't find anything monogrammed with Treopia on it. But as I have matured, I enjoy the uniqueness.
It is.
And I still have not, and I tell anybody, if you run into another Treopia, I guarantee the roots are Arkansas.
Thank you.
And another question? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So my question is this. When we hear your story, we hear the sacrifices that were made. If you
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
we can feel the sacrifices that were made as you went through your life. And so I'm curious, if you were to identify the most important thing that we gained from those sacrifices with integration, and especially in schools, and also the most important thing that we lost when we lost segregation. I'd like to hear your point of view on that, because you're embodying that. So that's my question.
Well, you know, and that's a very good question, and I hope I can answer it. one of the things when I talk about sharing my brother, especially my brother's experiences, one of the goals I guess I have is that I am hoping that young people, and maybe some not so young, would understand that history is not just about names and dates. It's about real people and real things that happen to real families. But again, your other point, I think you asked, what have we lost?
As a result of desegregation.
Well, you know, I go back to when I was growing up, where everything was a part of the community in which you grew up. One of the fallacies that occur, I think, when things are more spread out, is that sometimes people lose identification. And it shouldn't be that way. And it probably doesn't have to be that way. But I think we are still learning how to become a part of a larger world. And there are many things that need to happen. But I think one of the things, and again, this is going back to values that my family tried to instill in us, is that everybody has to feel that everybody else is important. And everybody has something to contribute. It may be the things, people do things differently from you, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. And the more we can learn about different ways of living, different ways of doing things, I think the better off we all will be. I hope I responded to your question.
Any other questions? Okay, sir.
In light of what's going on in Florida, the state of Florida, with your book and with your history, your family, your brother Ernest, with that history, cause a teacher to get a felony in the state of Florida?
Well,
and what's your opinion?
I said earlier, and I hope there are no Floridians in here, but I said if my book were rejected in Florida, that would be the highest honor I received. Yeah, it's just, again, I found in my life, personally, the more I have learned about people whose backgrounds are different from mine, the more I have grown. And I just think it doesn't make sense for people to reject that opportunity.
You know, it's a lot of fear, And as you were talking about your brother's experience at Central High School, and I thought about the pictures and the video that I've seen, and that hate is generated from fear. It's all fear. And the same thing is going on when somebody tells you that, well, we're not gonna teach an AP course on African American history because there's no value. Well, that's because there's fear around the value that there really is that exists in that type of history. So we have to recognize it for what it is.
And that's why you really have to believe that everybody is as good as anybody else. I mean, you really have to believe that. And when you believe that, then you are unafraid of other people. Because you realize that they're just important as you are, or you are just important as they are.
Ma'am?
This gentleman over here just, read my mind, my comment or question, which going through my mind, and we've known each other for several years now, Treopia and I, every time I listen to you, I learn something new, or I have a new moment, or I have a new transformative thought. And at the beginning of this, I mean, the struggle, the attack against, diverse narratives, right? Like the desperate clinging to white supremacy as a way of forming knowledge, especially in education. I've been an educator for 30 years, is not new. The attack on, critical race theory, and I'm putting that in quotes because anything apparently now qualifies, is not only a silencing of more formal histories, but in excluding, honest histories and replacing them with a perpetuation of false histories, like, this Columbus, white narrative. Not only is a silencing of sort of the more famous great minds that we think of, like Frederick Douglass, but children's capacity to tell their own stories in response to those stories. It's a silencing of the children in these classrooms who are going to identify, like, when you were a child and, the power of your story and your experience, that this is asking students to, it's telling the, children that their stories don't matter either. It's a silencing of, it's a deadening and a killing off of so much. And it's not new, but it keeps rearing its ugly head, like 1930s, 1950s, 2023. It's the same gig, just with different players. And it's horrifying to me that we're still here. After all this time, they're just rearranging. And I don't know, I wish there was some simple solution to just kind of stop it. But it might be, it might be a million small stories like this that we don't give up. We just keep finding new inroads to confront it as we see it. But on another note, I don't know if I shared this with you ever or not, but my father was a reporter for Life magazine at the time that the Little Rock Nine were, and I've gone through I have all of his old, like, original, like, yellow, torn, faded, like, crumbling under my fingertips kind of reporting. And I have some of the original Little Rock Nine, like, reporter stringer reporting, and I want to give it to you. I have it in my drawer, that my father and your brother were at the same place at the same time during those events. And that's just another way that we're connected. So
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
I would really appreciate that. In fact, one of the things that I have, and I made the mistake of giving it to my brother, I shouldn't have done, but I had the guest book from his graduation, and in the guest book is listed M.L. King, Montgomery, Alabama, $15.
See, that's very valuable.
And that was, now that would be worth about $150.
Maybe even more if it's in really good condition.
But I really appreciate, what you were saying. Again, we don't value other people, I feel, the way that we should. If you realize that other people are as important as you think you are, I think it would make a lot of difference. I cite that when I started working with the National Board, my responsibility was to increase the number of teachers of color who became National Board certified. And at that time, I realized I didn't know enough about Indigenous Americans as I felt I should. So I took an opportunity to, one of my first meetings was held at Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And I was just blown away. And what it reinforced in me is that we don't take the time to learn about other people. If we knew or experienced, had some of those experiences, we would value and cherish the kinds of things that we can learn.
And so I'll put a plug in right now for museums, not just this one, but museums in general. Because museums are those places that preserve the story and should be preserving the truth. Now, we know that sometimes, there might be a special interest that is behind a museum, and you have to be careful of that. But that's why you go to multiple museums, so that you can confirm these stories. So that's the first thing that I'd say. The second thing, it is so critical that we get our elders' stories. We must get their stories. We must have that information, because, if we don't get it, it literally can disappear. So I think that's a really important way of ensuring that we have the history. Last question, because I see Terri is coming down here to tell me, okay, enough, lady. Oh, we got two. Okay, 1, 2, and then that's it. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your family stories. And it was interesting to hear that you had a teaching career here in Baltimore. I was wondering, did you have any reckoning with city schools as your mother kind of did with Little Rock public schools? Was there any sort of reckoning that you had with city schools? I'm actually a city schools teacher myself, so it'd be interesting to hear that.
Well, thank you for the question. I guess the answer is that I came during a time that everything was wonderful. It was really, I admit that I came in the mid-50s, the late 50s. And at that time, Baltimore schools, I think, had integrated a few years before, and kindergarten again was on the rise. And I was privileged to be a part of all the positive things that were happening. So the answer to your question about whether or not I experienced some of the things my mother, and I'm sure there are other things that I like what you said about getting stories from your elders. There are things that I don't know that my mother experienced that she just never talked about. But again, I admit I was lucky. I didn't have any of the confrontational experiences that perhaps others have had. But thank you for asking.
A fun fact, Baltimore was the first school district to desegregate after Brown versus the Board of Education. DC was second. And then you had to get into the 1970s before Mississippi schools were desegregated. Just a fun fact.
I'm sure, I think I mentioned in my book, Mississippi was, when I was growing up, was the place not to be.
Right, exactly. Ma'am?
Thank you. As you were sharing with all of us about the values that your mother and your family instilled in you, it made me think of these two things that I've come across. Once while I was a student in undergrad school, I came across a book by an author, and in his book, it references you are no greater than or less than anyone else. You're only equal to yourself. So that has always stayed with me. So it reminds me of the values that you are speaking of. And to your other point that you had shared with us about worrying, I was at work and it was on a Saturday. I was a college student working 3 different jobs, trying to work myself through college. Didn't want to be at work on a Saturday, of course. And I was listening to the radio, this pastor came on, and he said, if you're gonna worry, don't pray. If you're gonna pray, don't worry. So those are two things that have motivated me in my life. And I appreciate you being here and sharing your book. And my spirit is encouraging me to tell you that I do feel blessed that you're here today. And I'm glad that my fiance and I, even though we came just to visit the museum, I feel blessed to have stumbled upon this book talk today. So thank you
so much. Thank you.
And we're so happy you did that. We're so happy you stumbled in here.
Yes, yes.
Well, please join me in thanking Treopia Green Washington. And she is going to be signing books, I think, over here. If you are interested in her signing a book, let me just mention that if you feel like driving back out to Baltimore, I mean, it's not that far really. Rockville, Baltimore, not that far. On February 11th, we will have a film, Frederick Douglass in 5 speeches, and that will be on the 11th. And check the website, which is lewismuseum.org for the time. The other thing is, did you all know that Frederick Douglass took February 14th as his birthday? Well, he did. So we will be having some programming around love and liberation because Frederick Douglass chose February 14th for his birthday. So again, just check the website and you can see the programs that are coming up. We thank you all so much for being here with us. Please take an opportunity to look at the items that Treopia brought. I mean, Oprah's in the picture. You know, she just literally, she is Forrest Gump in Treopia. So please take a look at those and get your book signed. And thank you again for coming. If you're not a member of the Lewis, we encourage you to become a member and visit with us frequently. Thank you so much.
Thank you.